Good morning. I'm really pleased to be here and was very excited at Sue's invitation to come to the Primary One Practitioner Forum, where you've been considering assessment in Scotland and the standardised assessment. Sue gave me a kind of little group of things to talk about. Primary One assessment, play-based learning, playful learning, and relationships with curriculum. And I've headed this up as Some Thoughts, in which I will also share with you my own perspectives. Governments want to be able to compare well between their nations and others, and there's an imperative there for thinking about how they're going to do that, how they're going to demonstrate the return for the investment in education. And it means, I think, for us that we have to acknowledge that education is highly political. It may not have been at the start of my career. I started teaching in 1970, but it certainly is now. And actually, as I look back down the years, I can see the moments where nursery education was on the map, where we were beginning to offer a guaranteed place for every 3- and 4-year-old, and how we've arrived at today with a huge swell and expansion in early childhood, which means that children coming on into Primary One are probably different in nature than they were at the start of my career. So those imperatives have led, I think, to governments globally thinking about how education can be more accountable and what the benefits are to children. And I think that's extremely well intentioned, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the best experience for children. And there's also a lobby, which I'll come to, which is very strongly against any formalised assessment of the youngest of our children. Those ideas that education is political, that people can look back or forward in a career, lead me to thinking about what my worldview is, and in fact to think about how that influences for others, how they see children, what model of child they hold, when they see the child as competent or creative. In research, we call that the ontology of research, and I'm now a researcher, have been for probably 25 years since I entered the university sector. But the other 23 years of my career were absolutely teaching in early childhood, in special education, and in further education. And I think that leads to a need to acknowledge what we bring to this role, whatever it is. So in a teacher's worldview, in a researcher's worldview, there are sets of beliefs that are likely to position them in particular ways towards how they approach their work. And I think in there is a kind of rooting for a lot of people in early childhood that it's not appropriate to assess small children in a formal way. But assessment is the business of teaching. We need to know how children are doing. We need to know that we're taking them well through curriculum. We need to think about how that impacts on them as well. For me, I'm rooted in an idea that humans understand each other by watching and by listening, and that self-understanding is a kind of reflection of the world, what the world gives you. It's a philosophy of meaning-making, of observation and exploration, of narrative, and particularly of interaction. And I think it recognises the complexity of the educational experience for us as adults, but also for children. So going on in there, if I have a view of the child as creative and competent, I want to be able to surface their abilities, their strengths, their capacity to problem solve. And so I have in parallel what happens in play and what happens in assessment. We need to know if children are creative. We need to enhance that. We need to gauge where they're at in their learning so we can build on from it. And so we can be accountable. We need to recognise their problem solving, their argumentation, their capacity to talk about what they know, to report. And in there, in those social skills and the speech and the language, there's the question of, can they perspective take? Can they look at the world through anybody else's shoes? Because that is what helps self-regulation, which is also a skill we're looking for. And in play too, we can see their executive function, their capacity to operationalise, to organise, and their emotional regulation. So if we can enhance all of those attributes through playful learning, they're also the attributes we seek to gauge through assessment. We might be looking at reading levels, we might be looking at mathematical skill, but if we look differently through this playful lens as well, we might feel it's more important to focus on literacies and numeracies than the specific skills at a given age. And that brings me on to this whole question of when assessment might be most appropriate. I think I've alluded to aspirations, expectations, opportunities, entitlements, but also what contribution can children make, because learning happens in relationships with the teacher, with other adults, with the children in their class, but also, of course, in the home situation. And this diagram shows all the elements of that, from leadership to voice and perspective, to pedagogy and play-based learning, to responsive assessment, but not least to equity and social justice and inclusion. And in there for children, their agency, their voice, their funds of knowledge that we need to be able to recognise if we're going to build on their learning, their dispositions, their motivations, and in a different model, we also need to be aware of their social capital. What is it they bring from home, from preschool? And they're not novices when they come into school anymore. They've had 2 years of potentially now full-time preschool education, equivalent to the primary school day. And that, I think, leads perfectly to a statement I'm going to make, which is my position on what has been mentioned already today, a kindergarten level. And I query whether we need this. In Scotland, we actually have the perfect situation of a 3 to 6 level of our curriculum for excellence. And we need, I think, to address that. It's a gift. I don't think we need another stage. I think we need to look at what we've got and to work effectively with it. And that means combining playful learning with appropriate assessment that can help us take children's learning forward, and do that in cooperation. Thinking then about what to assess, when to assess, how to assess, and why, leads me to query if we've got the timing right on this. Is sometime in primary 1 the best time to be gauging children's knowledge, to be gauging where they're at in their learning? Might it be more appropriate to do this when they're well established in nursery, perhaps in their last term in nursery? Or, if we're thinking of an early level, do we assess at the beginning of it and at the end of it? I think that curriculum phase makes us have to ask, should we test regardless of age? Our children are a whole year apart in age, if not further in development, when they are in any year of our school system. Is it so that we can assess, say at Christmas, when some children are still 4 and others are not that far off being 6? It's a good question, and it leads me back to the statement at the start about assessment being and education being a political issue. They've become so. I'm inclined to think that some of our problems with this have arisen from the gossiping that's gone on, and I used that advisedly. There has been an awful lot of talk about the assessment process. A bit of scaremongering, a bit of missing the point about the purpose, maybe a misapprehension in government about what assessment will do, and whether whether in fact this is a good for the future. I like numbers, I like to know where children are at, but I think you can do it through a good storybook. And if we're focusing on literacies and numeracies and not skills of reading, which not all children will achieve during their primary 1 year, and of course we need to know that, then I think there is some merit in having an assessment design which works from a good storybook, which has criteria and which we are all capable of following and generating parallel information. Would it do the same job as standardised assessment? The jury's out on that. Education is political. This issue that we're considering of assessment is not just in the locus of Scotland. Of course it's not, although Scottish education is what we're concerned with. Currently across the world there is an interest in what's going on in early childhood. Governments see early childhood as instrumental. We all see the ambition to give children the chance to reach their potential. There has been a development through the OECD across the rich nations of the world to look at the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study, which is it's actually been dubbed Baby PISA. And there's a lobby, a very strong lobby amongst academics across the world that this is inappropriate for the youngest children. They don't have Alison as we do in our early level assessment. They have Tom and Mia, and they're trying to focus on emerging literacy, emerging numeracy, self-regulation, social and emotional skills. Very much as we are, and at age 5. But across those countries, at age 5, many children are still in early childhood settings, not in the first phase of, I'm not saying formal, but formalised education. This lobby that is so against the Baby PISA, which is going to relate to the cross-country results on PISA itself, really argue that we already have the knowledge and the data, and they make a critique which I think has useful elements for us in Scotland. Are we reducing the political to the technical by having an assessment for all? Are we self-aware about the impact of this? Do we acknowledge, and yes we do, we're trying to respond and consult, do we acknowledge the criticisms, and what are those criticisms? Does the tool that we're looking at value or dismiss diversity? And how does it relate to the exercise of power? So my last question is, by assessing all children at a given time, but not necessarily the same age, further marginalise the children who are already disadvantaged. We know who they are. We know we need to take special concern to create the best opportunities. But that process doesn't start at 5. It starts pre-birth. It's an exciting time, and I hope these positions I've shared will be of some contribution to the debate. Thank you.